Hello and welcome back to episode 2 of the Only Murders in the Building Watch Long podcast, brought to you by JC Productions. Today we have the funeral service of Ben Glenroy, as you can tell by my attire, so join me as we pay our respects to the beloved star. Let's get straight into it with episode 2, The Beat Goes On. We start with Ben monologuing while falling to the ground, which we then see is actually him rehearsing Death Rattle in his dressing room with Oliver and having trouble understanding the script and what Death Rattle is actually about. Next, we are back in the present and we see Katie on the phone as she walks through the theatre with the line, "No, he definitely died the second time," and hangs up as she sees Oliver. Katie is in the process of deconstructing the set while Oliver tries to convince her that the show isn't over by calling the producers Donna and Cliff, who are avoiding his calls, so Oliver decides he needs to confront them in person. We then see Mabel in her apartment rewatching Girl Cop, her favourite Ben Glenroy film. This scene gives us a flashback of Mabel taking photos of Ben's body in the Arconia after his death. Next, we see a scene of Mabel imagining talking to Ben where he is in his Girl Cop costume. This is similar to when Mabel imagined talking with Tim Kono back in season 1. They have a chat about feeling like they haven't done much in life and have wasted time. This is where we get the line from Ben, "The people who figure their shit out right away are boring. The late bloomers, people like us, we make the world go round. You can afford to take your time. What you can't afford to do is waste it." Which isn't something you can picture Ben saying, which reinforces that this is all in Mabel's imagination. Then we see Charles opening his opening night gift, where he sees a note saying, "Dear Charles, happy opening night, fuck you, Ben," which shows that Charles and Ben didn't get along as referred to in his speech before his death. Oliver walks in saying he's going to go to the funeral. We know Charles was questioned by the police and he has a doctor's note saying he's too weak to kill. Oliver decides to try and speak to the DeMios at Ben's funeral, and we find out that Charles and Mabel are also planning on attending, mainly to do some investigating of their own. People we see at the funeral are Oliver, Charles, Mabel, Greg, Kimber, Ty, and Bobo. The 3 podcasters are taken to Overflow Room 3, where Ben's funeral is being streamed on a television from upstairs. Salt is added to the wound for Oliver, who believes he should be upstairs, when he finds out that random walk-ins also belong in Overflow 3. Mabel stumbles across a guy called Greg wearing a security badge and who claimed he did security work for Ben. He had already heard of Mabel, so he's most likely a listener of the podcast. He says he knows everything about the threats and the crazy fans and knows how to spot the troublemakers, like the ones in Ben's play. He then goes into his opinions on the cast. When talking about Kimber, he says, "harmless ingenue or a woman scorned." Then he moves on to Ty, stating, "strapping heartthrob or overambitious hothead." And then for Bobo, he says, "that one writes itself," as we see him crying while eating popcorn. Mabel asks if Greg is investigating as well when he invites her to follow him to look at his files and bring the old guys if she wants. He also says he hasn't shown the files to the cops as he doesn't trust them. We hear in the funeral that Ben was fired from his first TV show when he was 8 years old, which was obviously a big deal if it was still being brought up at his funeral, no less. Oliver rings Charles's phone as he knew he could use the ringtone blaring as a distraction to sneak to the other room. Mabel brings Charles with her to follow Greg and find themselves in a room full of Ben Glenroy memorabilia. Fun side note, of all the films Ben has been in, as we can see from the posters on the wall, are Sex Panther, Cobra, Cobra 2, Cobra 3, Girl Cop, Chinook Rising, Ant Family Adventures, Hunnigan's Wedding Night, and Labrador Receiver. A dog called Ben comes walking out and Mabel realises she hadn't seen Greg before, which he brushes off as saying he must be good at his job. Charles wants to leave as he is getting bad vibes from Greg and thinks he's a psycho, while Mabel tries to convince him that Greg is just a fan and tries to prove it by pointing out the many photos of Ben and Greg, when she realizes they're all photoshopped. They go to leave when Greg attacks them both by drugging them unconscious, maybe with chloroform. On his way to the other room, Oliver bumps into critic Maxine and tries to convince her to show her review to Donna and Cliff to get them to keep the show going. We find out that this is Oliver's first show in 15 years after the tragic events of Splash. Maxine breaks the news to Oliver that she didn't like Death Rattle, and that at the funeral, your leading man is giving a better performance today than he did the night that I saw him. She leaves saying that Oliver shouldn't hold back. We then see a flashback of Oliver trying to comfort Ben while he is rehearsing, as Ben doesn't know if he can ever be himself and feels like he has to have a ridiculous premise for him to be good. And Oliver reassures him, saying it's okay to just be you, and that he was scared too, but exhilarated, as he believes they are onto something. The flashback ends, and we watch with halted breath as Oliver collapses on the stairs of the cathedral. We now see Charles and Mabel wake up chained to toilets in a dingy basement. They believe this is the end, as Greg obviously killed Ben and they know too much, so he's going to kill them too. Mabel confesses that the reason she likes Ben and Girl Cop is because when her dad died, her mum didn't leave her room and she watched Girl Cop by herself a lot, and she dreamed that Ben's character would come and take her away from that place. But she says that the show got her through that time as well as her mum, as she heard her mum laughing in her room and then realised after a joke was made on the show that she was laughing at the show too. So Mabel felt like she was watching it with her mum and laughing together again, even if they weren't in the same room. We then find out from Charles that the reason that Ben didn't like Charles from the beginning is because Charles had him fired from Brazos after he was made a series regular playing boy genius Timothy Bush. Charles told the director after the table read that Ben was a phony, which led to Ben's firing. This was the first role mentioned earlier in the funeral that he was fired from at 8 years old. Ben still feels not good enough because of that incident, and that's why he goes into places acting like a jackass to hide his vulnerability. Ben also reveals in the flashback that he was supporting his mum and brother at the time with his acting, so it also affected them when he was fired. He told Charles that he could get him fired from Death Rattle as revenge, but he wouldn't. He was going to make it hell for Charles instead. Back in the present day, Greg wheels in a trolley of torture devices when we find out that Greg believes that it was Charles that killed Ben, and because Greg is so upset by this, he kidnaps them both to kill them as revenge. Mabel notices Greg has a Death Rattle hanky, which was the opening night gift, which Greg admits he took from Ben's body the night he died. The police break in just the nick of time and free Charles and Mabel. Detective Biswas is introduced to us in this scene as well. As he's getting arrested, we learn that Greg left the Arconia 2 minutes after Ben died. We now see Oliver is back home with his son Will and is told to change his diet and to stay away from stressful environments, as the next heart attack might not be so small. Mabel believes that Greg didn't kill Ben and concludes they need to figure out whose handkerchief Ben was holding when he died. They reckon before Ben fell, he must have tried to grab something to stop him from falling and only managed to grab the handkerchief. We then see a scene of Charles, Mabel and Will do a routine in Oliver's imagination, which leads him to want to continue with Death Rattle, but with a twist. The DeMios agree to meet with Oliver and he reveals that he is going to turn Death Rattle into a musical. While the final info we hear is that Mabel believes that the killer is someone in the show. that's it for all the information we learned in episode 2 of Only Murders in the Building. And so again, I will go through all the information we know about each of the characters. And this is notes from episode 1 as well. There's Charles, Mabel, Oliver, Loretta, Tobit, Joy, Howard, Jonathan, Dickie, Ben, Kimber, Ty, Clifford DeMeo, Katie, Donna DeMeo, and finally, Bobo. That concludes episode 2 of the watch along of Only Murders in the Building. I hope you enjoyed. There wasn't as much information in this episode to go through, so it might be shorter than the last. It probably is. But thank you for everyone who's been watching. And yeah, hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll see what happens in episode 3. Bye for now.